Dennis Jones spent his days navigating the marble corridors of the Jones estate, a boy lost in the shadows of his own home. To the high-priced staff and his own father, Dennis was a tragedy to be managed, a blind 8-year-old child deemed incapable of understanding the high-stakes world around him. But Dennis possessed a secret superpower that none of the adults suspected. He was fluent in Italian. It was the language of his late mother, a secret world of words he kept alive in his mind while the rest of the world assumed he lived in total silence. The tension becomes immediate when Dennis is sitting in the kitchen corner, ignored by the nanny Alisha Blake. Amidst the hum of the mansion's malfunctioning humidity system, which had begun to fall as a surreal indoor rain, he hears a whispered phone call. Alisha speaks 3 words in Italian that make Dennis's blood run cold. Nell'espresso stasera. In the espresso tonight. This creates an instant ticking clock scenario. As Dennis hears the rhythmic clink-clink of a silver spoon stirring a porcelain cup, he realizes he is the only person on earth who knows that the billionaire of logic, Kwon Tae-jin, is about to take his final sip. A powerful man is seconds away from death, and his only hope is the one person he has spent years overlooking, the young blind boy who can hear the truth through the rain. The humidity inside the Seoul mansion was calibrated to a perfect 60%, but this morning, the high-tech sensors had glitched. Instead of a soft, invisible mist, a surreal fine rain drifted from the recessed ceiling vents, coating the minimalist marble surfaces in a shimmering wet film. Kwon Tae-jin stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of his study, his sharp charcoal suit already catching the microscopic beads of water. He didn't move. To Tae-jin, the malfunction was merely a variable to be corrected, a minor flaw in a world he demanded be flawless. He was a man built of cold logic and jagged edges, a billionaire who had turned a tech startup into a global empire through a refusal to feel. At 38, Tae-jin viewed his life as a series of spreadsheets. Even his son Dennis was a line item he didn't know how to balance. Since the accident that took his wife and left the 8-year-old boy in permanent darkness, Tae-jin had retreated behind a wall of silence. He didn't know how to speak to a child who couldn't see the world he had built, so he simply didn't speak at all. The sound of the indoor rain hitting the polished floors was a rhythmic metallic pitter-patter. Tae-jin checked his watch. A heavy platinum piece that caught the dull morning light. 7:45 a.m. Right on schedule, he heard the heavy double doors creak open. He didn't need to turn around to know it was Alisha Blake, the nanny. He could hear the heavy, confident strike of her heels against the wet marble, a sound that always felt too loud for a house of mourning. "Your morning espresso, Mr. Kwon," Alisha said, her voice a practiced melody of professional warmth. Tae-jin finally turned. His face was a mask of stoicism, his dark eyes reflecting the gray sky outside. He watched as Alisha placed the silver tray on his obsidian desk. Beside the tray, standing in the shadows of the doorway, was Dennis. The boy looked small in his navy suit, his black glasses shielding eyes that saw nothing, yet his head was tilted slightly to the left, as if he were catching a frequency no one else could hear. Tae-jin offered no greeting to his son, no good morning to the boy who stood shivering slightly in the damp air. He reached for the white porcelain cup. As he lifted it, a faint, wispy trail of vapor rose, not the brownish steam of coffee, but a strange, glowing green mist that tinted the sharp lines of his jaw. He didn't notice the hue. He was already thinking about the board meeting at 9. He brought the rim to his lips, the bitter aroma filling his senses, unaware that the empire he had built was about to crumble with a single sip. Dennis stood perfectly still, his small frame partially obscured by the heavy velvet drapes of the dining room. To anyone else he was just a boy staring into a void, but for Dennis, the world was a symphony of textures and vibrations. He could feel the fine mist of the indoor rain settling on his glasses, each droplet a tiny weight. He adjusted his ears, filtering out the mechanical hum of the mansion until he caught the sound he was looking for. The sharp, rhythmic friction of silk against silk. Alisha was moving toward the kitchen. As she stepped away, Dennis let his mind drift back to the only warmth he had ever known. He remembered his mother's voice, a soft, melodic contrast to the cold marble of his current life. She used to hold him close, her breath smelling of vanilla, whispering stories in a language that felt like a secret song. "Il mio piccolo tesoro," she would coo, tucking him into bed. Those Italian lullabies were the last things he had memorized before the world went dark, and he clung to them like a lifeline. He had never told his father he understood the language. In this house, silence was his only protection. The sound of a phone being tapped against a palm snapped him back to the present. He heard the faint whoosh of the kitchen swinging door. Quiet as a shadow, Dennis followed the trail of Alicia's heavy perfume, something floral and cloying, until he reached the edge of the granite island. Alisha thought he was simply an ornamental part of the room, a child who couldn't see her face and therefore couldn't see her intent. She clicked her phone on, her voice dropping into a low, conspiratorial register. She wasn't speaking English. "Sì, quasi pronto," she whispered, her Italian sharp and northern, unlike his mother's soft Roman lilt. "Il caffè sul vassoio. Lui non sospetta nulla." Dennis felt a chill that had nothing to do with the indoor rain. The coffee is on the tray. He suspects nothing. He bit his lip, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He remembered his mother telling him that Italian was the language of the heart, meant for love and poetry. But coming from Alicia's mouth, the words sounded like shards of glass. "Una dos lenta," she continued, a faint, cruel smirk audible in her tone. "Entro stasera, Illinois grande Kwon Tae-jin sarà solo un ricordo." A slow dose. By tonight he will be a memory. Dennis gripped the edge of the cold granite, his knuckles turning white. He couldn't see the glowing green mist rising from the cup in the other room, but he could hear the death sentence being signed in the language of his lullabies. The woman his father trusted to raise him was counting down the seconds of his father's life, and Dennis was the only one in the entire glass empire who understood the betrayal hanging in the air. Dennis retreated into the corner of the pantry, his breathing shallow and silent. While his eyes were fixed on the darkness of his lenses, his other senses expanded, mapping the kitchen with terrifying precision. He didn't just hear Alisha moving. He heard the chemical shift in the air. As she uncapped a small heavy glass vial, the scent hit him, not the bitter, earthy aroma of dark roast, but something synthetic, metallic and sharp, like ozone before a lightning strike. He listened to the sound of liquid tension. The drip-drip-drop of the toxin into the espresso didn't sound like water. It was viscous, hitting the surface of the coffee with a heavy, muffled thud that suggested weight and density. As Alisha stirred, the spoon didn't clink with its usual bright silver ring. The liquid had thickened, changing the acoustics of the porcelain cup into a dull leaden thrum. In his mind's eye, Dennis imagined the chemistry of betrayal. He felt the heat radiating from the tray, but it was accompanied by a strange, tingly sensation on his skin, the glow his mother used to describe when talking about things that were beautiful but dangerous. The air around the tray turned heavy and cloying. He could almost hear the molecules of the poison reacting with the caffeine, a faint, effervescent hiss that warned him of its potency. Alisha exhaled a long, satisfied breath, her heart rate steady, the terrifying calm of a professional. "Perfetto," she whispered. The word hummed through the damp air, vibrating against the wet marble floors. Dennis felt the vibration of her footsteps as she lifted the tray. The weight was uneven. She was careful, obsessive about not spilling a single drop of the lethal brew. To the world, she was a dedicated servant bringing a billionaire his morning fuel. To Dennis, she was carrying a cup of concentrated silence. As the kitchen door swung shut with a soft final whoosh, the boy realized that the metallic scent of the poison was now trailing toward his father's study. He stood trembling in the indoor rain, his hands reaching out into the void, knowing that the chemistry of his father's life was about to be permanently altered by the glowing green mist he could only perceive through the terror in his soul. The malfunction in the ceiling vents had escalated from a fine mist into a torrential rhythmic downpour that mocked the sterile perfection of the hallways. Water cascaded down the fluted marble columns, turning the expansive floor into a treacherous glass-slick mirror. For Dennis, the rain inside was a cacophony of chaos. The familiar acoustic landmarks of his home, the subtle echo of the vaulted ceiling, the soft hum of the air filtration, were being drowned out by the relentless splash thud of water hitting stone. He stepped out from the pantry, his small leather shoes immediately losing their grip on the sodden floor. He stumbled, his palm slamming against a wet wall to steady himself. The world felt like it was dissolving. Every surface was cold, weeping and dangerously smooth. He could no longer rely on the gentle vibrations of the house. The rain created a white noise that masked Alisha's retreating footsteps. He had to move, and he had to move fast. Navigating by touch and memory, Dennis crawled more than he walked, his navy suit soaking through until it felt like a heavy, restrictive skin. He reached the grand foyer, where the sound of the water was loudest, echoing like a storm trapped in a cathedral. The scent of the poison, that sharp metallic ozone, was fading, drifting further away toward his father's study. Panic flared in his chest, a hot contrast to the freezing water dripping down his neck. He pushed himself up, his hands sliding across the floor as he searched for the transition where the marble met the thick, damp rug of the hallway leading to the west wing. He found it, the texture change giving him a momentary sense of direction. He didn't have the luxury of caution. Every second he spent slipping in the artificial storm brought his father closer to that first fatal sip. His glasses were useless, obscured by a film of water, but he kept them on, a habit of armor in a world that judged his eyes. He could hear the faint, muffled clink of the silver tray as it was set down in the distance. The sound was a strike of lightning in his dark world. He threw himself forward, sliding, falling, and rising again, his heart drumming a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He was a blind boy lost in a man-made deluge, but the Italian words of betrayal were louder than the rain, driving him toward the one door he had always been too afraid to knock on. Inside the study, the world was unnervingly quiet, save for the rhythmic, muffled drumming of the rain against the skylights. Kwon Tae-jin sat behind his desk of obsidian and steel, the weight of his charcoal suit heavy with the moisture he refused to acknowledge. He didn't look at Alisha as she moved through the room. He only heard the steady, confident strike of her heels and the soft, clinical sound of the silver tray being lowered onto the stone surface. Clink! The sound of the porcelain cup meeting the tray was sharp, a tiny, brittle explosion in the silence. Tae-jin reached out, his long fingers wrapping around the handle of the white cup. As he lifted it, the liquid inside didn't ripple like water. It shifted with a thick, syrupy density. He held it just inches from his face, and for a fleeting second, his stoic expression wavered. A strange, luminous vapor drifted upward, a glowing green mist that curled around his nostrils, smelling faintly of ozone and bitter almonds. To any other man, it would have been a warning. To Tae-jin, it was merely an anomaly of temperature, another detail to be filed away and ignored. He closed his eyes, his mind already miles away, calculating the risks of the afternoon's merger. He began to tilt the cup, the rim pressing against his lower lip. The ceramic was cold, unnervingly so for a freshly brewed espresso. Outside the door, the sounds of the indoor rain intensified, but within the study, the atmosphere felt vacuum-sealed. Alisha stood by the door, her hands folded neatly in front of her ruffled apron. She wasn't breathing. Her pale skin seemed to glow in the dim light, her eyes fixed on the cup with a predatory intensity. She watched the dark, poisoned liquid creep toward the edge of the porcelain, a silent countdown beginning in her head. Tae-jin tilted the cup further. The first drop of the thick, green-tinted brew touched his tongue, the metallic sting of the toxin beginning to register against his palate. He prepared to swallow, his throat muscles tightening to receive the slow-acting death Alisha had promised over the phone. He was a man who prided himself on seeing every move on the board, yet he was a fraction of a second away from the only move he could never take back. The silence of the room was absolute, a heavy, suffocating shroud that was about to be shattered by the only voice in the mansion that still knew how to scream. The heavy mahogany doors of the study burst open with a violent crash, the sound splintering the vacuum of the room. Dennis didn't just enter. He collided with the space, his small body drenched, his navy suit clinging to him like a second skin. He was a vision of frantic, wet desperation, his black glasses sliding down his nose as he lunged across the slick floor. Tae-jin's hand froze. The rim of the porcelain cup was wet against his lip, the first bitter, metallic drop of the espresso already stinging his tongue. He looked up, his brow furrowing in a rare display of confusion. He saw his son, the boy he usually treated as a silent shadow, transformed into a force of raw vocal panic. Non-Burlo! Dennis's voice ripped through the room, high-pitched and jagged. Alicia's face drained of color. Her practiced smirk vanished, replaced by a mask of pure, frozen horror. She reached out, her fingers twitching as if to grab the tray, to hide the evidence, to silence the child. But Dennis was faster. He didn't stop at the doorway. He scrambled toward the desk, his hands outstretched in a frantic stop gesture. "Evelino!" Dennis screamed, his voice vibrating with the cadence of the lullabies his mother had taught him. "L'ha detto lei al telefono. C'è del fumo verde. Papa fermati." Tae-jin's world tilted. He didn't know much Italian, but he knew the word veleno, poison. He looked down at the cup in his hand, and for the first time, he truly saw the thin, glowing green mist curling over the liquid, a mist that seemed to pulse with a malevolent synthetic light. He looked at Alisha, whose eyes were darting toward the exit, her professional composure shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. The billionaire didn't drink. With a slow, deliberate movement that masked the sudden thunder of his heart, he lowered the cup. He didn't place it on the tray. He let it drop. The porcelain shattered against the obsidian desk, and the thick, syrupy liquid splashed across the surface. Where the espresso touched the stone, it began to hiss, a foul chemical odor rising as the glowing mist intensified. Dennis collapsed against the edge of the desk, gasping for air, his chest heaving under his soaked suit. He was trembling, the adrenaline of the lunging run finally giving way to terror. Tae-jin stood up, his charcoal suit dripping with the indoor rain, his eyes fixed on the boy who had just used a dead language to save his life. The silence that followed was no longer the silence of the glass empire. It was the heavy, breathless silence that precedes a total revolution. The porcelain shards lay scattered across the obsidian desk like broken teeth, but it was the liquid that commanded the room's terrified silence. As the espresso pooled and then cascaded over the edge of the desk, it didn't behave like coffee. It didn't soak into the fibers of the Persian rug. It hissed. Tae-jin stood motionless, his shadow cast long and jagged by the dim study lights. He watched as the thick syrupy brew hit the intricate patterns of the wool rug. Instantly the glowing green mist intensified, blooming into a thick, noxious cloud that smelled of scorched earth and sulfur. The deep crimson dyes of the rug began to bubble and fade, the fabric curling back as if recoiling from a flame. Within seconds a jagged, blackened hole began to eat its way through the floor, the chemical heat of the toxin melting the synthetic fibers and charring the wood beneath. Dennis was still huddled against the desk, his ears ringing with the sound of the chemical reaction. He couldn't see the destruction, but he could hear it, the sharp, predatory crackle of the corrosion and the heavy, wet sound of the liquid eating through the luxury that had previously defined his father's world. The ozone scent was overwhelming now, a physical weight in the air that tasted of copper and death. Tae-jin's gaze shifted from the smoking ruins of his floor to Alisha. The nanny was backed against the mahogany door, her hands clawing at the wood behind her. The sinister, wide grin she had worn moments ago was gone, replaced by the gray, ash-like pallor of a caught predator. She looked at the hole in the rug, the physical proof of the slow-acting heart failure she had intended to induce, and knew that her perfect crime had been dismantled by the one variable she hadn't accounted for. I can explain," she stammered, her voice thin and reedy, a ghost of its former melodic warmth. Tae-jin didn't answer her. He didn't need to. He looked at the burn on the rug, then at his son, who was shivering and drenched by the indoor rain. The evidence was absolute. The billionaire of logic finally saw the truth. The woman he had paid to protect his son was a monster, and the son he had treated as a broken shadow was the only person in the world who had truly been watching over him. The acidic hiss of the poison was the last sound of Tae-jin's old life, a corrosive end to his era of cold, arrogant isolation. Tae-jin did not call for his security team. For the first time in his career, the billionaire of logic understood that his logic had been a sieve, letting the most dangerous threats slip through while keeping the only person who mattered at a distance. He looked at Alisha, who was still paralyzed against the door, and then at the phone clutched in her trembling hand. In that silent, rainy room, the realization crashed over him like the artificial storm outside. If his own son's nanny was a hired killer, then the guards at the gate, the drivers in the garage, and the assistants in his lobby were no longer assets. They were shadows hiding knives. He stepped over the smoking, blackened hole in the rug, his movements slow and deliberate. He didn't move toward Alisha to strike or even to shout. He moved toward his son. Dennis was still shaking, his wet navy suit heavy and cold, his head bowed as if waiting for a reprimand for the chaos he had caused. Tae-jin reached out, his hand hovering in the air for a second, a hand that usually only signed contracts and dismissed subordinates, and then he placed it firmly on Dennis's shoulder. The boy flinched at the contact, a reaction that stung Tae-jin more than the metallic tang of the poison still on his tongue. He had built an empire of glass and steel, a glass empire designed to be impenetrable, yet he had accidentally imprisoned his own heart within it. He had viewed Dennis's blindness as a void, a broken piece of a life he couldn't fix, never realizing that while he had been staring at screens and spreadsheets, his son had been the one truly watching, listening, and protecting the family. "Dennis," Tae-jin said. His voice was no longer the sharp, cold instrument of a CEO. It was thick with a raw, unfamiliar gravel. "You saved me." He looked around the room, the minimalist furniture, the expensive art, the high-tech sensors currently drenching them in rain, and felt a sudden violent loathing for it all. These were the walls he had built to keep the world out, but they had only succeeded in keeping his son at a distance. He realized that the disability wasn't his son's lack of sight, it was his own lack of vision. He had been blind to the courage standing right in front of him. With a decisive click, Tae-jin reached into his pocket and pulled out his personal, encrypted phone. He bypassed his usual security detail entirely, calling a private extraction firm he had kept in reserve but never used. "Clear the house," he commanded, his eyes never leaving Dennis. "Everyone. I want the staff out, the perimeter locked, and a forensic team for the espresso." He hung up and knelt in the indoor rain, disregarding his charcoal suit as it soaked up the water from the floor. He pulled Dennis into a sudden clumsy embrace. The walls of the glass empire hadn't just been breached, they were being torn down from the inside out. Tae-jin finally understood that to be a father, he had to stop being a king, and to truly see his son, he had to finally learn how to listen. 1 year later, the world was no longer a place of cold marble and metallic rain. Tae-jin stood on the soft, manicured grass of a sprawling estate outside the city, where the air smelled of lavender and cedar instead of ozone and floor wax. The high-tech sterile skyscraper had been replaced by a home designed not to impress, but to be felt. Here the walkways were lined with textured stone paths that guided a person through the gardens, and the rooms were filled with the warmth of natural wood and low, soft acoustics. Behind him stood the legacy of his transformation, a series of low-slung, sun-drenched buildings known as the Jones Sensory Center. It was more than just a research facility. It was a sanctuary Tae-jin had funded to ensure that no child with sensory differences would ever be considered invisible or broken. The center specialized in pediatric linguistics and sensory development, providing children with the tools to turn their perceived weaknesses into their greatest strengths, just as Dennis had. Dennis was no longer the boy shivering in a soaked navy suit. He stood at the center of a group of children, wearing a comfortable sweater and his familiar black glasses, laughing as he described a story in a mix of English and fluent, beautiful Italian. He moved with a confidence that came from knowing he was heard. He was no longer a line item in a businessman's life. He was the heartbeat of it. Tae-jin watched his son from a distance, his hands tucked into the pockets of a casual linen jacket. The stoic mask he had worn for decades had finally cracked, leaving behind a face that was softer, older, and infinitely more human. He no longer obsessed over spreadsheets or calculated risks with zero sentiment. He spent his mornings learning Italian from Dennis and his evenings walking the tactile paths of their garden, finally understanding that the most valuable things in life aren't seen with the eyes, but heard with the heart. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the center, Dennis paused his story and turned his head toward his father. Even without sight, he locked onto Tae-jin's presence with unerring precision. He held out a hand, a silent invitation. Tae-jin crossed the grass and took his son's hand in his own, no longer a clumsy embrace, but a steady, permanent bond. The glass empire had fallen, and in its ruins they had built something far more durable. A life founded on gratitude, protection, and a love that spoke every language.